The council chamber of the Drathari Compact was built to make anyone feel small. The walls rose higher than any building had a right to rise, curved like the inside of an egg, and lit by cold blue light that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. 9 seats circled the center of the room, one for each of the great species that ruled the compact, and in every seat sat a being that had, at some point in its history, been the strongest thing in its part of the galaxy. Today, all 9 of them were afraid. The fear had started 3 weeks earlier, when a compact scout ship passed through a quiet, unremarkable system on the edge of known space. The scout was not looking for trouble. It was mapping gas giants and counting asteroids, the kind of boring work that nobody argued over. Then its sensors picked up a signal, a broadcast, something being sent out into space, over and over, on a loop, from a blue-green world called Earth. The scout captain, a Drathari elder named Oven Ket, had ordered the recording pulled and reviewed. What she saw inside it changed everything. It was not a battle, it was not a weapon test, it was footage, old, grainy, imperfect footage, of humans training, soldiers running through mud under live fire, divers descending into freezing black water for hours in metal tubes, knowing that if something went wrong, no one would come for them in time. Pilots practicing maneuvers that had a real chance of killing them, again and again, until they stopped being afraid of dying and started only caring about the mission. Ordinary people, in factories and hospitals and schools, going back to work the very next day after their cities had been bombed, because stopping was never something they seemed to consider. None of it was recent, most of it was 100 years old or more, but the Drathari analysts who studied it did not know that. They only knew that this was a species that trained its young to accept death without hesitation, that rebuilt without complaint, that seemed to treat catastrophe as a Tuesday. To the 9 species of the compact, all of whom had been conquered at some point and knew exactly what it felt like to be beaten into obedience, this was the most frightening kind of enemy. Not one that was strong, one that did not care about strength, because it had already decided it would win no matter the cost. "They are not soldiers," said Oven Ket, standing before the council with the recording paused behind her. A frozen image of a exhausted young pilot climbing out of a smoking cockpit and grinning. "Soldiers can be broken. This is something else. This is a species that has already broken itself, and kept going anyway." Councillor Threz Ul Vorn, the oldest member of the assembly, and the leader of the warrior caste, leaned forward. "How large is their fleet?" "We do not know. Their world has no visible orbital defenses. Their ships appear crude. Slow drives, poor shielding. Nothing that would trouble a compact patrol boat." "Then why does this frighten you?" Oven Ket looked at him for a long moment. "Because if they are this willing to suffer with such simple technology, imagine what they will become in 100 years, when their technology catches up to their will. We have seen this before, Counselor. Every species we ever conquered was strong once, in its own way, before it grew comfortable. This species has not grown comfortable. It has grown into something worse. It has grown patient." The room was silent. Then Councillor Threz Ul Vorn spoke the words that would decide everything. "Then we do not wait for them to grow. We end it now, while it is still small enough to end." And so, the compact made its decision. They would not send a fleet, not yet. A fleet could be seen coming, could be prepared for, could turn a quiet execution into a long and costly war. Instead, they would send their champion, alone, the single greatest weapon the compact possessed, Kaldrith Vun, called the Unbroken, who had never lost a battle in 200 years of service, who commanded a warship named the Reckoning that could level a continent in an afternoon. One ship, one warrior, sent to a system that had no defenses worth mentioning. It was not meant to be a war. It was meant to be an ending, quick and clean, before the humans even understood what was happening to them. They did not know that a small, quiet trading species called the Ithven had a station only 2 jumps from the compact's border, and that the Ithven had, for reasons of their own, become fond of the strange, loud, generous humans who bought their machine parts and told terrible jokes and never once threatened them. They did not know that an Ithven merchant named Res had overheard 2 Drathari officers discussing the Earth problem over drinks, and that Res had immediately, quietly, sent a warning ahead to the one human contact he trusted. Which was how, 11 days before Kaldrith Voon's warship crossed into the solar system, a message reached Earth that changed the course of human history. Elena Reyes had not planned to be in the room when the message arrived. She was 44 years old, a former language teacher and diplomat who had spent the last 6 years working on Earth's first contact protocols, the quiet, careful work of preparing humanity for a day that might never come, when someone finally showed up. She had helped write the guidelines for what to do if aliens said hello. She had never once imagined writing the guidelines for what to do if aliens said goodbye. The message came through the Ithvan trade relay, translated imperfectly, full of gaps and warnings. A powerful alliance of species called the Drathari Compact had judged humanity to be a threat. They were sending their greatest warrior, alone, aboard a warship that outclassed anything Earth had ever built, and they intended to destroy human civilization before it grew too strong to stop. The Global Coalition Council, the body that had been formed years earlier, specifically to handle the possibility of first contact, met in emergency session within 6 hours. Elena was called in, not because anyone expected her to have answers, but because she had spent years thinking about exactly this kind of impossible conversation. The debate in the following days was loud, desperate, and mostly useless. Military leaders wanted to gather every warship Earth possessed, still primitive by galactic standards, barely capable of leaving the solar system in force, and meet the alien warship in open battle, hoping that human ingenuity and desperation could somehow overcome a 200-year unbeaten champion. Elena sat through 3 full days of these arguments before she finally stood up and said the thing she had been turning over quietly in her mind since the first hour. "We will lose that fight," she said. "Not might lose, will lose. Every report we have on this ship, the Reckoning, describes something 100 years ahead of anything we can build. If we send our fleet up there, we will not slow it down. We will just die faster, and angrier, and it will not change what happens next." General Okonkwo Adeyemi, the head of the coalition's newly formed Void Defense Force, glared at her from across the table. "So what do you suggest, Dr. Reyes? That we do nothing?" "No," Elena said. "I suggest we do something they don't expect. We send a ship. One ship. No weapons." The room erupted. Elena led it, waiting for the noise to die down on its own, the way she had learned to do in 100 smaller, less important meetings. "They are sending their greatest warrior to destroy an enemy," she continued, once she could be heard again. "Every report from the Ithvan describes this compact as a warrior culture, built on conquest, built on strength proving itself against strength. If we send warships, we confirm exactly what they already believe about us, that we are a threat that must be crushed before it grows. We give them exactly the fight they expect, and we lose it. But if we send a ship with no weapons at all, we do something they cannot have a plan for. We ask a question they don't know how to answer. What do you do to an enemy who refuses to be an enemy? They'll destroy it in a second," Adeyemi snapped. "One shot. It'll be over before it starts." "Maybe," Elena said, "but maybe not. And even if they do destroy it, Earth loses one ship and its crew, instead of every fleet we have, and every soldier who dies, trying to fight a battle we cannot win. This is not a plan built on hope that it will work. It is a plan built on the fact that every other option guarantees failure, and this one, at least, has a chance." It took 4 more days of argument, 3 more emergency sessions, and 1 very long night where Elena sat alone with the coalition's president, going over every possible outcome, before the decision was finally made. Earth would build one ship, not a warship, but something new, something that had never existed before. A vessel built entirely for communication, for negotiation, for showing an approaching enemy exactly who humanity was without ever raising a weapon to prove it. They called it the Lantern. It was not large. It carried no missiles, no cannons, no shields beyond the minimum needed to survive a solar flare. What it carried instead was every recording device Earth could spare, every translation system available, a crew of 11 hand-picked specialists in linguistics, history, and psychology, and, at the very center of the ship, a data core containing something Elena had insisted on personally, the complete, honest history of humanity. Not just the wars, not just the training footage that had frightened the compact in the first place. Everything. The wars and the peace treaties that followed them. The famines and the harvests that ended them. The cruelty humans had done to each other, and the long, slow, difficult work of learning to stop. Elena was named captain, not because she had any military experience. She had none. But because the mission was not a military one. It was, she said in her final address to the coalition before launch, a conversation that has to happen, whether we are ready for it or not, and I would rather be the one holding the door open than the one standing behind a wall that is about to be knocked down anyway. The lantern launched from Earth orbit on a cold morning in early spring, watched by a global broadcast audience of nearly 6 billion people, most of whom did not know if they were watching their species' last message or its first real conversation with the rest of the galaxy. Elena Reyes stood on the observation deck as Earth shrank behind her and did not look away until it was nothing more than a blue dot lost among the stars. Somewhere ahead of her, still weeks out but closing fast, Caldrith Voon sat in the command chair of the Reckoning, reviewing the same terrifying footage that had convinced 9 species to send him here, and feeling, for the first time in 200 years of undefeated service, a small and unfamiliar thread of doubt. He did not yet know that the enemy he was sailing toward would not be an enemy at all, at least not in any way he understood the word. He only knew his orders: find the human homeworld, and end the threat before it could grow into something the Compact could no longer control. He had never failed a mission. He did not intend to start now. But 200 years is a long time to go without ever being surprised, and Caldrith Voon, though he did not know it yet, was about to meet the first thing in 2 centuries that his sword could not answer. The Reckoning dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the solar system, past the orbit of the outermost ice giant, in a burst of light that would have been visible to any human telescope, pointed in exactly the right direction, at exactly the right moment. It was a ship built the way a closed fist is built, no wasted space, no soft edges, every part of it designed for a single purpose. It was 3 kilometers long, black as the space around it except for a thin line of red running along its spine, and it carried enough firepower to turn a moon into gravel. On its bridge, Caldrith Voon watched the tactical display update as sensors swept the system ahead. He was tall even by the standards of his own people, the Vashtu, a species built for endurance rather than speed, with gray skin that had gone a paler shade over 2 centuries of service, and eyes the color of old amber. He had commanded the Reckoning for 80 of those 200 years. In all that time, no enemy fleet had ever survived first contact with his ship. "Report," he said. His sensor officer, a small 4-armed Ithvan conscript named Dessa Kor, the Compact's crews were built from a dozen conquered species, a fact that Caldrith had stopped finding strange, sometime around his 50th year of service, answered without looking up from her console. "1 vessel detected, champion. Small. Approaching from the 3rd planet, no escort, no visible weapon systems, no shields beyond standard radiation hardening." Caldrith frowned. "1 ship. 1 ship, champion." He waited for more information, for the sensors to find the fleet that must surely be hiding somewhere, waiting to spring some trick. There was nothing, just the single small vessel, moving toward the Reckoning at a modest, unthreatening pace, broadcasting an open communication signal on every frequency it could manage, over and over, the way a lighthouse repeats its warning. "Political Officer Vresh will want to be informed," said Dessa quietly. Caldrith's jaw tightened slightly. Vresh Oltan was the Compact's overseer aboard the Reckoning, a Drathari bureaucrat whose job was to make sure the champion's decisions always matched the Compact Council's wishes. Caldrith had won every battle of his career using his own judgment. He had spent the last 30 years learning to tolerate a shadow standing over his shoulder while he did it. "Inform him," Caldrith said, "but I will not wait on his opinion to decide whether 1 small ship deserves my attention. Open a channel to the vessel." A moment later, the bridge's main view screen flickered, and a human face appeared. She was not what Caldrith expected. He had reviewed the footage that started this mission. Young soldiers in mud, pilots in burning cockpits, all teeth and fury and desperate motion. This woman was none of that. She looked to be middle-aged by human standards, dark-haired, calm, dressed in a simple gray uniform, with no rank insignia that Caldrith recognized. She sat with her hands folded on a table in front of her, and she looked directly into the camera, the way a person looks at someone they respect, not someone they fear. My name is Elena Reyes, she said, and the translation software rendered her words a half-second later in the low, formal Drathari trade tongue. I am the captain of this vessel, the Lantern. I've been sent by the people of Earth to speak with whoever commands the ship approaching our system. I understand you may have been told that we are dangerous. I would like the chance to explain who we actually are, before anything happens that cannot be undone. Caldrith studied her face for a long moment. On the bridge behind him, he heard the soft click of Dessacor's console, as she quietly, without being asked, began recording everything. I am Caldrith Vun, he said finally, champion of the Drathari Compact. I have been sent to end the threat your species poses before it grows beyond our ability to contain it. You should know that this outcome is not something I take lightly, but it is not something I have been given the freedom to reconsider. I understand, Elena said, and there was no fear in her voice, only a kind of steady patience that Caldrith found he had no framework for. Then let me ask you something, Champion Caldrith. If your orders are already final, and nothing I say can change them, why are we still talking instead of already dead? It was a fair question, and it caught him slightly off guard. The honest answer was that no enemy had ever asked him that before, because no enemy had ever had the chance. Every other target the Compact had sent him against had either fled, or fought, or begged, all responses he understood perfectly well. This woman was doing none of those things. She was simply talking to him, as though the outcome of this conversation genuinely still hung in the balance. Because, he said slowly, you have brought no weapons to a fight you know you cannot win, and I find that I would like to understand why, before I finish what I was sent here to do. Then may I tell you a story? Elena asked. It's not long. It's about my people, and about why we chose to send this ship instead of every warship we own. Behind Caldrith, a voice cut in before he could answer. Champion, this is not authorized diplomacy. The Council's order was clear. Vresh Oltan had arrived on the bridge, his narrow Drathari frame wrapped in the deep violet robes of the Compact's political core, his voice carrying the particular flatness of someone used to being obeyed instantly. Caldrith did not turn around. The Council's order was to end the threat, Overseer. I have not yet determined what the threat is. I intend to find out before I act, as I have on every mission I have ever completed for this compact. The threat is their willingness to die without surrender. You have seen the footage. I have seen soldiers training, Caldrith said. I have not yet seen a war. There is a difference, and it is one this compact has apparently forgotten, if it no longer trusts its champion to notice it. Vresh's mouth thinned into a hard line, but he said nothing further, at least not yet. Caldrith turned back to the screen. Tell your story, Captain Reyes. Elena took a slow breath before she began. She had rehearsed 100 versions of this conversation during the long weeks of transit, had argued with her own crew about what to say and how to say it, and had finally settled on the simplest approach she could find, the truth, told plainly, without exaggeration, and without apology. A very long time ago, she said, long before we had ships that could leave our own solar system, my species fought wars against itself, terrible ones. Wars that killed tens of millions of people, that flattened cities, that came close, more than once, to ending us entirely. The footage your scouts found, the training, the soldiers, the pilots, all of that comes from one of those wars, nearly 100 years before this moment. It is not who we are today. It is who we were, once, when we were younger and more frightened, and had not yet learned better. She paused, watching Caldrith's face for some sign of whether he was listening or simply waiting for her to finish. His expression gave away almost nothing, but he had not ended the transmission, and she took that as permission to continue. But here is the part I actually want you to understand, champion. After that war, and after several more like it, we did not simply put down our weapons and forget. We built things, alliances, laws, whole systems of cooperation, specifically so that we would never have to fight each other like that again. It took decades. It is still not finished. We are not a perfect species, and we never claimed to be. But the reason your scouts found footage of soldiers willing to die is the same reason you should trust that we are not the threat your council believes us to be. We remember exactly what it costs to fight, better than almost any species could, because we did it to ourselves first, long before we ever had the chance to do it to anyone else. Caldrith was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, His voice had lost some of its earlier flatness. "You are telling me that the willingness to suffer your scouts observed is not evidence of aggression. It is evidence of memory." "Yes," Elena said. "Every soldier in that footage, every training exercise, exists because we never want to be caught unprepared again, not because we intend to go looking for a fight. There's a difference between a species that trains for war because it wants one, and a species that trains because it remembers what happens when it isn't ready for one. We are the second kind, I promise you that." "Promises," said Vresholtan coldly, from somewhere off camera on the Reckoning's bridge, "are easily made by a species facing annihilation." Elena's eyes shifted slightly, acknowledging the second voice without losing her composure. "That's true," she said, "which is exactly why I didn't come here with a fleet, asking you to trust our word. I came here with one unarmed ship, so that whatever you decide it looking at the truth instead of at a threat display. If we wanted to trick you, Overseer, we would have sent warships dressed up as something friendlier. We sent the opposite. We sent a ship that cannot lie to you, because it has nothing to hide behind." For the first time since the conversation began, Caldrith felt something shift inside him. Not doubt exactly, not yet, but the first crack in a certainty that had held steady for 200 years. He had fought thousands of battles. He had faced enemies who screamed defiance at him with their last breath, enemies who wept and begged, enemies who fought with a kind of desperate, animal fury that he had long ago stopped finding surprising. He had never once faced an enemy who simply sat, calm and unarmed, and asked him to look closer before deciding anything. "I will need to verify what you have told me," he said finally. "Send your data, all of it, the wars, and whatever came after them. I will judge for myself whether your species has learned what you claim to have learned." "I'll do better than that," Elena said, and for the first time since the channel opened, something like a small, tired smile crossed her face. "I'll come to you. In person. Face to face, no weapons, no tricks. I think this conversation deserves more than a screen between us, if you're willing." Behind Caldrith, he heard Vresholtana draw a sharp breath, already preparing an objection. Caldrith raised one gray hand, and the Overseer, for once, went silent. "Come then, Captain Reyes," Caldrith said. "I will meet you myself, at the edge of my own ship, unarmed as you are. Let us see what kind of species sends a single ship to face its executioner, and calls it a chance instead of a surrender." The channel closed. On the bridge of the Reckoning, silence stretched for a long moment before Vresh finally spoke. "You cannot be considering letting this human aboard your ship, champion." "I am not merely considering it," Caldrith said, already rising from his command chair. "I have decided it. The Council sent me to judge whether this species is a threat. I intend to judge it properly, Overseer, with my own eyes and my own ears, and not simply with the fear your Council brought me across half the galaxy to act upon." He walked from the bridge without waiting for a response, leaving Vresholtan standing rigid in the cold blue light, and leaving, though none of them yet understood it, the first true crack in 200 years of certainty. One small, calm, unarmed human woman had done, in a single conversation, what no army, no weapon, and no desperate last stand had ever managed to do to the Compact's unbroken champion. She had made him wonder if he was wrong. Elena Reyes stepped off the shuttle and onto the deck of the Reckoning, with her hands open and empty at her sides, the way she had planned it during the long, sleepless hours before the meeting. The hangar bay around her was enormous, tall enough to swallow the lantern hole 3 times over, lined with fighter craft that looked less like machines and more like weapons that had simply been given wings. She counted at least 40 crew members watching her from the catwalks above, most of them species she had never seen before. Tall, thin ones with too many joints in their arms, squat armored ones with faces like closed fists, and a scattering of the gray-skinned Vashtu, Caldrith's own people, standing apart from the rest with the particular stillness of soldiers waiting for an order. Caldrith Vun stood at the center of the bay, alone, unarmed, exactly as he had promised. Up close, he was even larger than the viewscreen had suggested, nearly 7 feet tall, his amber eyes catching the hangar lights in a way that made them seem to glow faintly. He did not move toward her. He waited, the way a mountain waits, and let her come to him. "Captain Reyes," he said, when she stood close enough that he no longer needed to raise his voice. "You came alone." "So did you," Elena said. "It seemed only fair." Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile. His face was not built for one, but something adjacent to it, a small loosening around the eyes. "Walk with me," he said. "There is a place aboard this ship where we can speak without an audience, and without my overseer listening to every word for a reason to object." He led her through corridors that smelled faintly of ozone and metal, past rooms she did not recognize, and machinery whose purpose she could not begin to guess, until they reached a small observation chamber near the ship's outer hull, a quiet room with a single wide window looking out at the stars and, faintly, the blue-green curve of Earth in the far distance. "Sit, if you wish," Caldrith said, gesturing to a bench along the wall. He remained standing, his hands folded behind his back, looking out at the window, rather than at her. "You wanted to know why we didn't come armed," Elena said, settling onto the bench. "I'd like to actually answer that now, properly, if you're willing to hear the whole thing." "I am listening." "When we first realized your compact was coming," she said, "our military wanted to fight. They wanted to gather every ship we own, and meet you in open battle. And I understand why. It's what most species would do. And if I'm honest, some part of me wanted that too, because it feels like doing something instead of nothing. But I've spent most of my life studying how conversations fail, how two sides that don't understand each other end up fighting wars that neither one actually wanted, simply because nobody was willing to be the first to put down their weapon and ask a question instead of making a demand." She looked up at him. "I told our council that if we sent a fleet, we would lose, and worse than losing, we would prove every fear your compact already had about us. A species willing to fight to the last ship, exactly as your scouts believed. But if we sent one ship, with no weapons at all, we would be asking your compact a question it might never have been asked before. What do you do with an enemy who refuses to be one?" Caldrith was silent for a long moment. "You risked everything, on the hope that my people would rather ask that question than simply answer it with force." "I risked everything, on the hope that somewhere in your compact there was someone capable of asking it," Elena said. "I didn't know it would be you specifically. I only knew that whoever commanded the ship sent to destroy us would have to look at an unarmed vessel and decide, personally, whether to pull the trigger anyway. That decision matters, champion. It's the only thing in this entire situation we could actually control." Caldrith turned from the window at last and looked at her directly. 200 years ago, he said, "I was not a champion. I was a young warrior of the Vashtu, the last generation born free, before the compact came to our world and showed us exactly how small our strength truly was against theirs. I remember standing on a battlefield that was already lost, watching my people's fleet burn, and understanding for the first time what it meant to face an enemy who simply would not stop, no matter what we threw at them." He paused, something old and heavy moving behind his amber eyes. "I have spent 2 centuries since then, becoming the very thing that broke my people, because the compact offered me a choice: serve, and be strong enough that no one could ever do to me what was done to my world, or refuse, and be crushed alongside everyone I had ever known. I chose to serve. I have told myself, every year since, that I chose correctly." "Do you still believe that?" Elena asked quietly. Caldrith did not answer immediately. "I believed it," he said finally, "until 3 weeks ago, when I was shown footage of your soldiers and told they represented an existential threat to 9 great species. I looked at that footage, Captain Reyes, and I did not see a threat. I saw my own people, 2 centuries ago, on that dying battlefield, desperate, unwilling to surrender, fighting not because they believed they could win, but because giving up was somehow worse than dying. I did not want to believe the comparison. It frightened me more than any enemy fleet ever has." Elena felt something tighten in her chest, some mixture of grief and recognition that she had not expected to feel for this enormous alien warrior standing in front of her. "Then you understand," she said, "better than anyone else in your compact, why we sent this ship instead of a fleet. You know what it looks like when a people fight because they have nothing left to lose. We are not that yet. We came here hoping to prove that we don't have to become it, if your compact is willing to let us choose a different path." "The Council does not want to hear that there is a different path," Caldrith said. "They have built an empire out of the belief that there are only 2 outcomes for any species they encounter: conquest or destruction. A species that neither submits nor fights back is not a category they have prepared for. Then maybe it's time someone showed them a third option, Elena said. The comm panel on the wall chimed sharply before Caldrith could answer, and Vresh Oltani's voice cut into the room, tight with barely controlled anger. Champion, you will return to the bridge immediately. There has been a development. Caldrith's expression darkened. What development, Overseer? The Council has grown impatient with your delay. A second fleet has been dispatched from compact space, under direct Council authority, to ensure the mission is completed, regardless of your personal reservations. It will arrive within 6 days. Elena felt the floor seem to shift slightly beneath her, though the ship itself had not moved at all. A second fleet, she repeated. They do not trust me to finish what I was sent here to do, Caldrith said, his voice low. They believe I have been compromised. Have you been? Vresh's voice asked coldly, still open on the channel. Caldrith looked at Elena for a long moment before he answered, and something in that look told her that the answer mattered more than either of them had expected it to. Only 3 days into a conversation that had begun with him prepared to destroy her entire species without a second thought. I have been asked to think, Caldrith said finally, addressing the Overseer without breaking his gaze from Elena. For the first time in 200 years, I have been asked to actually think about what I am doing, rather than simply doing it. If the Council considers that compromise, then perhaps it is not I who has changed, Overseer. Perhaps it is only that I have finally been given a reason to notice how little thinking I had been permitted to do before now. The channel went silent, though Elena suspected Vresh had not actually closed it, only stopped speaking, listening instead. 6 days, Elena said quietly. That's not very long. No, Caldrith agreed. It is not. He walked back to the window and looked out at the distant blue-green curve of Earth, silent for a long moment. Tell me the rest of what you came here to say, Captain Reyes. If a second fleet is already coming, regardless of what I decide, then we have very little time left to determine what, if anything, can be done about it. Elena took a breath, steadying herself. This was the part of the plan she had hoped they would not need. The part that depended not just on convincing one champion, but on reaching an entire compact, built on fear and conquest, in less than a week, with nothing but words, and a data core full of human history. There's something else on my ship, she said. Something I haven't shown you yet. A complete record. Not just of our wars, but of every species we've ever made contact with since we started listening to the stars, including some of yours. Including Champion Caldrith records the Ithvan traders were willing to share about the compact itself, about what happened to species that resisted, and what happened to species that surrendered completely. I think your council believes their own history is a secret. I don't think it is, not anymore. And I think if the right people saw it, all at once, it might change more than just what happens to Earth. Caldrith turned from the window, and for the first time since Elena had met him, something that was unmistakably alarm crossed his ancient, weathered face. Captain Reyes, he said slowly, do you understand what you are describing? You are not proposing to save your own species. You are proposing to challenge the foundation the entire compact is built upon. I know, Elena said. I told you we came without weapons. I didn't say we came without anything at all. Outside the window, unseen by either of them, the first faint light of the approaching second fleet was already bending space at the edge of the system, 6 days out and closing, carrying with it the full and unforgiving judgment of a council that did not believe in third options. Caldrith Voon, the Unbroken, looked at the small, calm, unarmed human woman sitting across from him, and understood, with a certainty that unsettled him more than any battle ever had, that he was no longer simply deciding the fate of one distant blue-green world. He was deciding, for the first time in 200 years of service, which side of his own history he actually wanted to stand on. The 6 days passed differently for everyone involved. Aboard the Lantern, Elena Reyes and her small crew worked almost without sleep, preparing the data core Elena had promised Caldrith, not just a record of human history, but a careful, verified compilation of everything the Ithvan traders had shared over the years about the compact's true nature. Records of species that had surrendered peacefully and been stripped of their culture, their languages, their names, folded so completely into the compact's structure that within 2 generations, nothing remained of who they had once been. Records of species that resisted and were destroyed outright. Their homeworlds left as warnings, empty and silent, orbited by nothing but debris. It was not proof of cruelty for its own sake. It was proof of a system, built over centuries, that had convinced itself there were only ever two choices for the outsiders it met, and had never once considered that a third choice might exist. Aboard the Reckoning, Caldrith Voon made a decision that would have been unthinkable to him only a week earlier. He began speaking, quietly and carefully, to members of his own crew, not the Vashtu, who owed him direct loyalty, but the conscripts, the Ithvan, and the others, the species who served the compact not out of pride, but out of the same fear his own people had once felt, watching their homeworlds burn. He did not tell them everything. He simply asked questions, the way Elena had asked him questions, and watched carefully who among them answered honestly, and who answered only with the fear the compact had trained into them. Dessa Kor, the small four-armed sensor officer, was the first to speak plainly. "Champion," she said, late on the fourth day, when the bridge had mostly emptied for the sleep cycle, "my grandmother's world resisted the compact 80 years ago. I have never been permitted to know what happened to it. I was told, when I was young, that it no longer mattered, because the compact had given me a place and a purpose instead. I have believed that for my whole life, because believing anything else seemed impossible to survive." "And now?" Caldrith asked. Dessa was quiet for a long moment. "Now I would like to know the truth, champion. Whatever it costs me to know it." Caldrith found, over the following 2 days, that Dessa was not alone. Slowly, carefully, a small number of the Reckoning's conscripted crew began to gather what courage they had, and ask the same question in different words. What really happened to the worlds that came before them? Vresh Oltan noticed the shift long before it became dangerous to him. On the 5th day, he confronted Caldrith directly in the ship's private council chamber, his violet robes rigid with barely restrained fury. "You are undermining 2 centuries of order," Vresh said. "Do you understand what you are doing? You are asking a crew of conquered species to question the very system that gives their lives structure and purpose. I am asking them to question a system built on the belief that fear and truth cannot exist in the same room together," Caldrith said calmly. "If that system cannot survive its crew learning the truth about it, Overseer, then perhaps the system was never as strong as the compact believed. The Council will not tolerate this." "The Council," Caldrith said, "sent a second fleet, because they no longer trust my judgment. I no longer feel any particular obligation to earn back a trust that was withdrawn the moment I began actually thinking about my orders, instead of simply following them." Vresh's eyes narrowed. "You would defy the compact, after 200 years of perfect service." "I would ask the compact one question, Overseer, the same question Captain Reyes asked me the very first day we spoke. If your orders are already final, and nothing anyone says can change them, why does the Council need to send a second fleet at all? Why not simply trust that their champion, given the full truth, will make the correct decision on his own?" Caldrith's amber eyes were steady, unblinking. "The answer, I think, is that the Council already suspects what I have only recently allowed myself to understand, that the correct decision, once all the facts are known, may not be the one they want made." The second fleet arrived on the 6th day, exactly on schedule. 11 warships, smaller than the Reckoning individually but overwhelming in number, dropping out of faster-than-light travel in a tight formation at the edge of the solar system, close enough that Earth's own primitive sensor networks picked up the gravitational disturbance and sent a wave of panic rippling across a planet that had spent 6 days holding its breath, waiting for news from a single unarmed ship 300 million kilometers away. The fleet's commander, a Drathari admiral named Corvith Van, hailed the Reckoning within minutes of arrival, his voice carrying the particular impatience of someone who had been sent to clean up another officer's failure. "Champion Caldrith," Corvith Van said, his image sharp and cold on the view screen. "The Council has authorized me to complete this mission, if you remain unwilling to do so. I would prefer not to have to report that the Compact's own champion stood aside, while an inferior fleet finished his work. Stand down, and allow my ships to proceed." Caldrith stood at the center of his bridge, Elena Reyes beside him. She had returned to the Reckoning the moment the second fleet's arrival was detected, choosing, without hesitation, to be present for whatever happened next, rather than watch it unfold from a distance. Admiral, Caldrith said, before your ships proceed, I would ask that you review a data transmission I am sending to your fleet now. It will take perhaps 20 minutes to examine properly. I do not ask you to change your orders. I ask only that you make your decision with full information, as I have been permitted to do these last 6 days. I have my orders already, Champion. I require no further information to carry them out. Then you require less than I did, Caldrith said, and I would ask you to consider what that says about the difference between us. He nodded to Desicor, who, hands trembling slightly, transmitted the data core Elena's crew had spent 6 sleepless days compiling, not just to Corvith Van's flagship, but to every vessel in the Second Fleet simultaneously, and, through a relay Rest the Ithvan merchant had quietly helped establish, to a dozen other listening posts scattered across compact space, populated largely by the same conscripted species that made up the bulk of every compact crew. For several long minutes, nothing happened. Then, across the fleet, small signs of disruption began to appear on the Reckoning's sensors. A warship briefly losing formation, a communication spike between 2 vessels that was not part of any authorized channel, a slow, uneven ripple of confusion spreading through 11 ships that had arrived, expecting a simple, unremarkable execution. Admiral Corvith Van's image reappeared on the view screen, and his earlier cold impatience had been replaced by something far more uncertain. Champion, he said slowly, what is this material you have sent my crews? The truth, Admiral, about what happened to the species that came before them. About what happens to species that surrender completely, and what happens to species that resist. I did not create that history. I only stopped participating in the silence that has kept it hidden. This is a mutiny, Vresh Oltan snapped, stepping forward on the Reckoning's bridge, his voice carrying to every open channel. Admiral Van, Champion Caldrith has clearly been compromised by prolonged contact with the human vessel. I recommend you disregard any transmission from the Reckoning, and proceed with the Council's original orders immediately. There was a pause, longer than Caldrith expected, before Corvith Van answered. Overseer, the Admiral said slowly, my own censor officer has just informed me that her homeworld's surrender, 3 generations ago, was not the peaceful transition of culture the Compact taught her it was. I do not know yet what to do with that information. But I do not think I can, in good conscience, order 11 ships to destroy an unarmed species, while my own crew is still absorbing the fact that they may have been lied to about the price of obedience their entire lives. Admiral, Vresh began. I did not say I am refusing my orders, Overseer, Corvith Van said sharply. I said I require time to think, which is, I understand, exactly what Champion Caldrith was also given, before he made his own decision. I believe I am owed the same courtesy. Vresh Oltan's face went rigid with fury, and in that moment, watching the Overseer's composure finally crack under pressure he had not anticipated, Caldrith understood that the true battle had never been about weapons at all. It had been about which truth the Compact's own people would be permitted to hear, and once heard, could never fully unhear again. This will not stand, Vresh said quietly, and turned toward the bridge's weapons console, the one station still under direct Compact political authority, regardless of Caldrith's command, capable of overriding the Reckoning's own systems and firing on the lantern directly, unarmed as it was, without needing Caldrith's authorization at all. Elena saw it a half-second before Caldrith did, and the small, sharp intake of her breath was the only warning anyone had. Caldrith moved faster than a being his size had any right to move, closing the distance to the weapons console in 3 long strides, his hand closing around Vresh Oltani's wrist, before the Overseer's fingers ever reached the firing controls. I have served this Compact faithfully for 200 years, Overseer, Caldrith said, his voice low and terribly calm. I have never once questioned an order I did not personally believe was justified, no matter what it cost me. I am questioning this one. I would ask you, with genuine respect for the authority you carry, not to force me to discover today what I am willing to do to protect an unarmed woman who came here, asking only to be heard. Vresh Oltan stared up at him, and for a long, suspended moment, the entire bridge held its breath. 11 warships and 1 small unarmed vessel hanging silently in the dark, waiting to learn whether 200 years of unbroken obedience had finally, truly, come to an end. Vresh Oltan's wrist remained locked in Caldrith's grip, for what felt like an hour, but was, by the ship's own recorded logs, no more than 11 seconds. Then, slowly, the overseer's hand fell away from the weapons console, and something in his narrow shoulders sagged, not in agreement, but in the recognition that he had already lost, whatever he chose to do next. "You understand what you have done," Vresh said quietly. "The Council will not forgive this champion. 200 years of service, undone in a week, because of one human woman and her unarmed ship." "I understand exactly what I have done," Caldrith said, releasing his grip and stepping back. "I have finally asked a question I should have asked 200 years ago, when I first agreed to serve the very system that destroyed my own homeworld. I asked whether obedience and truth were the same thing. They are not, Overseer. I am sorry it took me this long to notice." Across the open channel, Admiral Corvith Van had been listening to every word, along with every crew member on his 11 ships who had access to the shared frequency. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that had not been there before. "Champion Caldrith," he said, "I have spent the last hour speaking with my own crew, and with several officers on the other vessels in this fleet. I do not believe I am alone in saying that I did not join compact service to destroy an unarmed people, simply because my superiors were frightened of what they might one day become. I am recalling my fleet. Whatever consequence the Council intends for that decision, I would rather face it honestly than carry out an order I no longer believe in." One by one, across the open channel, other voices joined his, not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. Enough that the 11-ship fleet that had arrived to finish what Caldrith would not, found itself fracturing quietly from within, crew by crew, ship by ship, as the truth Elena's data core had carried, spread through minds that had spent generations being told there was no alternative to obedience. It was not a mutiny in the way Vreshel Tan had warned it would be. There was no violence, no dramatic seizing of ships. It was something quieter, and, in its own way, far more dangerous to the compact than any battle could have been. A slow, spreading refusal, crew after crew simply declining to fire, declining to proceed, declining to pretend any longer that they had not been shown something they could not unsee. The Compact Council did not take the news well. Within days, formal condemnations were issued, declaring Caldrith Voon a traitor and Admiral Corvith Van guilty of dereliction of duty. But condemnations, Elena would later reflect, are only powerful when the people receiving them still believe the ones issuing them deserve to be obeyed. Across a dozen worlds within compact space, the same data core that had spread through the fleet had also reached ordinary citizens. Through the quiet, patient network Rest the Ithvan merchant, and others like him had spent years building, without anyone in the compact ever noticing. It did not end the compact overnight. Empires built over centuries do not fall in a single season, and the 9 species who had ruled from that cold blue council chamber did not simply hand over their power because one champion had changed his mind about one small blue-green world. But something had shifted that could not be shifted back. Worlds that had surrendered generations ago and been told their old cultures no longer mattered, began, quietly at first and then less quietly, asking to know their own history. Species that made up the bulk of every compact crew, the ones who had always done the fighting and rarely done the deciding, began to ask why that had always been so. Caldrith Voon did not return to compact space. He remained, along with Admiral Corvith Van and roughly half of the Second Fleet's original crews, in orbit around Earth, not as conquerors, and not quite as guests either, but as something the galaxy had not yet built a proper word for. The first alliance between humanity and another people, built not on conquest or surrender, but on a shared decision to ask questions instead of simply following orders. Elena Reyes stood beside Caldrith on the observation deck of the Reckoning, 6 months after the day the ship had first appeared at the edge of the solar system, watching Earth turn slowly beneath them, blue and green and utterly unaware, for most of its 6 billion people, of how close it had come to a very different ending. "Your council will not simply let this go," she said. "Not the fleet. Not you." "No," Caldrith agreed. "They will not. There will be more ships, eventually. More champions, perhaps less willing than I was to ask questions before acting. The Compact does not easily forgive being shown its own history in front of the people it has spent centuries controlling." "Are you afraid?" Caldrith considered the question for a long moment, the way he considered most things now, carefully, without the reflexive certainty that had guided him for 200 years before this one. I have been many things in my life, Captain Reyes. Afraid was rarely one of them, because fear requires believing there is something left to lose, that you have not already lost. I lost my home a long time ago. I lost my certainty 6 days after meeting you. What remains, I find, is not fear. It is simply the desire to make whatever time is left matter, in whatever small way I am still capable of. Elena smiled, tired but genuine, the particular smile of someone who had spent months waiting to see if a single unarmed ship could actually change anything, and was only now beginning to believe that it had. For what it's worth, she said, I think you've already done that. My people used to tell each other stories about first contact, all the ways it could go wrong, all the fleets we might need to build, all the wars we might have to fight, just to survive meeting someone else out here. I don't think anyone imagined it might go like this. An unarmed ship, and a warrior who decided to ask a question instead of following an order. Perhaps that is exactly why it worked, Caldreth said. No one expected it, including the people who sent me here. An enemy prepared for weapons has no answer for the absence of them. It only has the space, finally, to think. Below them, Earth continued its slow, patient turning, unaware and safe, its 6 billion people going about lives that would, in the years to come, be shaped by a decision made not with fleets or weapons, but with a single unarmed ship and one small, steady woman who had understood, better than any general or admiral, that the strongest thing a species could send into the dark was not a show of force. It was the simple, stubborn insistence on being understood. News of what had happened at the edge of the solar system spread slowly across the galaxy over the following years, carried by traders like Ress, and by the crews who had once served the Compact and now served something closer to their own conscience. It became, in time, a story told among a dozen different species, in a dozen different languages, the story of the small blue-green world that had been sentenced to destruction, and had answered, not with its strongest weapon, but with its most patient voice. They called it, in the trade tongues that carried the story furthest, simply the Lantern's Choice. The moment a galaxy that had only ever known conquest or surrender first glimpsed a third way of meeting a stranger, and found, much to its own surprise, that the third way was stronger than either of the two it had always believed were the only ones that existed. Elena Reyes returned to Earth a hero, though she never much liked the word, and spent the rest of her working life helping to build the fragile, complicated, genuinely hopeful alliance between humanity and the growing number of former compact worlds that had begun, slowly and carefully, to ask what a galaxy built on something other than fear might actually look like. Caldreth Vun never became human, and never stopped being Vashtu, and never fully escaped the weight of 2 centuries spent serving an empire he had finally chosen to stand against. But he remained, for the rest of his long life, at Earth's side, not as its champion, and not as its conqueror, but as living proof of the thing Elena had believed from the very first day the Coalition Council argued about weapons and fleets and impossible odds, that sometimes the strongest thing you can bring to an enemy's door is not a weapon at all. Sometimes it is simply the willingness to be seen, honestly, and to ask, before anything else happens, whether the person on the other side of the door is truly willing to look.